much for coming. Try not to have too much feedback here. Too much feedback? All right, good enough. All right, I'm Miriam Gilbert, and I'm just delighted you're willing to come and share my passion for Shakespeare and things Shakespearean. So I'm just going to get going. There is a handout. There also will be, the quotations will be up on the screen. There will be no test. And the only other thing to say is that I did think once we had to change the date, and I realized that it was the Ides of March, that maybe you wanted a lecture on Julius Caesar, but I have scratched that idea. Everything we know about Hamnet Shakespeare is that he was baptized on the 2nd of February, 1585 in Stratford-upon-Avon. He was one of a pair of twins, and he was buried on the 11th of August, 1596. He was 11 years old. He was born, he lived, he died. And one more thing, he happened to be the only son of the most famous writer in history. I'm quoting from Graham Holderness's essay about Hamnet Shakespeare. It appears in a book called The Shakespeare Circle, an alternative biography, which is a collection of essays about people in William Shakespeare's personal and professional life. And that paragraph, you might think, isn't much to go on. But perhaps the very scantiness of information was the liberating force for Maggie O'Farrell's acclaimed novel, Hamnet, a novel of the plague year, of the plague. According to an interview in The Guardian, O'Farrell started thinking about the subject many years ago, and I'm quoting, "She first had the germ of the idea at school when an English teacher, yay, mentioned the existence of Shakespeare's son called Hamnet, who had died aged 11, 4 or 5 years before the playwright wrote Hamlet. She remembers sitting in a chilly Scottish classroom and putting her finger over the letter L on her copy of the play. The two names were, according to Stephen Greenblatt, entirely interchangeable at the time. Quote, the idea of this boy and of his name being used by his father just got under my skin. I could never forget about it. After years of compulsive reading about the subject, she grew increasingly frustrated by the way in which Hamnet had been overlooked by scholars, his death often dismissed as an inevitability of the high child mortality at the time. Now, I don't know whether I can defend all Shakespeare scholars on this point and on others, but I'm guessing that what people have been looking for is a personal response to this tragedy. This, by the way, is a famous portrait of Shakespeare, and this is the portrait by, it's a painting by Christian Siebold, which is used on the copy of the book. So just to let you know the two people we're looking at. Part of the problem is that we have such a personal response from one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, a well-known poet and playwright, often seen as a Shakespeare rival, but also author of the long poem in the first folio, praising Shakespeare as not of an age, but for all time. This is also, by the way, on your handout, number 2. Ben Jonson's 7-year-old son, named Benjamin, died of the plague in 1603, and Jonson's short poem expresses the father's love, his sorrow, his attempts to rationalize the loss, and finally, the bitterness. And I won't read the whole poem, but I think that the couplet at the end is very telling. For whose sake henceforth all his vows be such, as what he loves may never like too much. That couplet seems to me to be an attempt to shut out future love, and I find it very painful. It's sort of like saying, I don't want to commit to anybody like this again, because if he dies, it's going to hurt too much. We don't have anything like that from Shakespeare, and so scholars have, perhaps too quickly, suggested that Hamnet's death may not have mattered to him. Clearly, Maggie O'Farrell felt otherwise. And she was also struck by scholarly unwillingness to recognize the personal significance of Shakespeare naming his greatest tragedy after him. Come on, it's the same name. Hamnet is her attempt to give this boy, consigned to being a literary footnote, a presence and a voice. To say he was important and that he was not just another Elizabethan child statistic, and without him, we wouldn't have Hamlet and we probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night. So she was upset, not only by the dismissal of the importance of Hamlet's death, but also of what she saw as the erasure of his existence. In another interview, I read, after leaving university, she would ask friends if they knew the names of Shakespeare's children. Had they heard of Hamnet, the twin brother to Shakespeare's second daughter, Judith? When she told them about Hamnet, they thought she was making him up. They said, no. Are you sure? And I said, yes, I'm absolutely positive. And I thought, if they don't know, then maybe quite a lot of people don't know. So I'm guessing that the novel began as an exercise in reclaiming Hamnet, bringing him back to life, so to speak. But what did she have to work with? We don't have the kind of direct biography of Shakespeare that we would like to have. We have nothing as personal as this poem by Johnson. We don't have much other writing by Shakespeare other than the plays. We've got a few legal documents. He's mentioned in the church register. We've got his will. And of course, we do have his plays. But before we get to them, I want to ask, how much of the novel is true, or at least plausible? What do we know about Anne, or as I shall say, Agnes Hathaway, the other major character in the novel? How does the novel reflect what we know about the Shakespeare of Stratford's day? O'Farrell has clearly done her Stratford research. When I first read this novel during the pandemic, unable to travel to Stratford, where I have a second home, I sometimes found myself in tears as I pictured Henley Street. That's the birthplace. To your right, the section there would be John Shakespeare's glove, where he made gloves, and the window, people would come in and he would sell them. To the left, the house itself. Rother Market, which is now a paved thing, and I'm not sure if I can get the clicker to work. There we go. The birthplace is here. This is Rother Market, this whole area. The church is down here. It doesn't have the Royal Shakespeare on this map. The Royal Shakespeare Theatre wasn't around at that time. But Rother Market is now a paved space, which does indeed have a street market every Friday and sometimes on Saturday, and the church and the churchyard. It's clear that certain pieces of information stimulated what she based her novel on, whether we're talking about stuff specifically connected to Shakespeare or not. So, for example, there's the arrival of the doctor to see Judith, and the description is pretty memorable. On the doorstep is a terrifying sight. This would be handout 3 on your handout. A terrifying sight, a creature from a nightmare, from hell, from the devil. It is tall, cloaked in black, and in place of the face is a hideous, featureless mask pointed by the beak, like the beak of a gigantic bird. And this is an etching from about 1656. O'Farrell isn't making this up. They wore those masks to protect them. So that's clearly what she's going from. In a more complicated example, take the introduction of Agnes, as Anne Hathaway is called in the novel, and as she was named in her father's will. We look through the eyes of the Latin teacher, whom we know as William Shakespeare, although you will have figured this out already if you've read the novel, his name never appears. This is number 4 on your handout, but it's also here. And what I think is interesting is the figure, the Latin tutor, sees this person, believes it to be a young man wearing a cap, a leather jerkin, and so forth. There is some kind of bird on his outstretched fist, chestnut brown with a creamy white breast, its wings spotted with black. It sits hunched, subdued, its body swaying with the movement of its companion. It's familiar. I want to focus on that bird for a moment. What is it doing there? It's clearly comfortable. It's described as it's familiar, almost as if the person and the bird have a spiritual relationship. And then I found a description of the priest who married Agnes Hathaway and William Shakespeare. John Frith, vicar, an old priest, and unsound in religion, he can neither preach nor read well. His chiefest trade is to cure hawks that are hurt or diseased, for which purpose many do repair to him. And this is quoted from a government spy's report in a book by Michael Wood called Shakespeare. Now, Michael Wood, British broadcaster and historian, produced a TV series in search of Shakespeare and then a book based on that series, and he's fascinated, I would say obsessed, by the whole question of whether or not Shakespeare and his family were Catholics. In Shakespeare's time, it sort of depends what day you woke up on, whether the country was Protestant or Catholic, and I'm not going to go there. Because what Maggie O'Farrell, who must have seen that description John Frith picks up on, is the notion that John Frith, whatever his religious leaning, and clearly being an old priest and unsound in religion means Catholic, right? She picks up on the fact that he was someone known for his skill in dealing with hawks. And she seizes on that detail and creates Agnes's bond with the hawk and one of the qualities that make her unusual and special. And the last part of the quotation, seen from Eliza's point of view, Shakespeare's sister, is about the wedding and what will happen. Agnes says she knows this priest well. He is a particular friend of her family. It was him, in fact, who gave her the kestrel. He reared it himself from an egg, and he once taught her how to cure lung rot in a fountain. So from a text from Government Spy, we get this whole thing about Agnes and the fountain. And that's one of those places where you get a fact, and then you can see what the novelist did with it. Now, a much more extensive use of historical material comes with O'Farrell's portrayal of John Shakespeare, the father of William. We meet him in the novel's first chapter, and it's an unforgettable and vividly unpleasant introduction. Hamnet is looking for an adult so that he can get help for his twin sister who is ill. He hears a noise in the next room, and it's his grandfather. John Shakespeare is wheezing, he may be drunk, he's angry, he's called cutting, sharp, unpredictable, he has black humors, he's described in animal terms, first as an old sad toad on a stone, and then quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge, and without any provocation or reason, he grabs the boy's wrist and then strikes him with a cup just below the eyebrow, and things don't get any better from there. The abuse extends to everyone. John Shakespeare is physically striking his children and grandchildren or humiliating people with caustic remarks. We also get what is, for me at least, an explanation for this behavior. There are any number of references in the novel to John Shakespeare's change in status. And this is on your sheet, number 5, but also on the screen. Indeed, just a few pages after he attacks Hamnet, we hear and see him trying to get a group of men to go to a tavern with him. And here is how O'Farrell describes it. He wants nothing more than to reinstate himself as a man of consequence and influence, to regain the status he once had. He can do it. He knows he can. All he needs is the ear of these men, whom he has known for years, who know him, who could vouch for his industry, his loyalty to this town, or, if nothing else, a pardon or a blind eye from the guild and the town authorities. He was once bailiff, and then a high alderman. He used to sit in the front row of the church and wear a scarlet robe. Have these men forgotten that? How can they not have invited him to this meeting? He used to have influence. He used to rule over them all. He used to be someone. And now he is reduced to living on whatever coin his eldest son can send back from London. And what an infuriating youth he had been, hanging about the market square, squandering his time. Who would have thought he would amount to anything? And of course we smirk to ourselves since we know who his eldest son was. Now the facts are here. John Shakespeare was once the bailiff, we would say the mayor of the town council. He was an alderman. There were 14 of them. They composed the town council. That's true. But things changed. And in 1586, which is the year after Hamnet was born, he was replaced as alderman for not attending meetings. He had financial problems too, some of which may have come from his illegal dealings in wool. And there is a scene in the novel where Eliza, William's younger sister, finds William in an attic space crammed with wool bales. And when William asks John Shakespeare why the attic was filled with wool bales and what was their intended purpose, John Shakespeare is angry but controlled. Their father leant across the cart and seized a fistful of his son's jerkin. "There are no wool bales in this house," he said, giving his son a shake with each word. "Is that clear?" Eliza's brother we know who he is, had stared steadily back into his father's eyes without blinking. "Clear enough," he had replied eventually. "The fact is, it was illegal to trade in wool without a special license from the crown. John Shakespeare did not have such a license. He was called a brogger, which means an illegal trader. He was fined at least twice. He was also at one point charged with usury. He stopped paying taxes, and he stopped attending church, and was listed as a recusant, that's someone who refuses proper authority, and he was fined for that as well." And O'Farrell gives us this from John Shakespeare's point of view. She also indicates that everybody knew about this. Joan, Agnes's stepmother, completely objects to Agnes's relationship with William. This is number 6. "I know your family," Joan had said, screwing up her face into a contemptuous pout, pointing at the tutor. "Everyone knows them. Your father and his shady dealings." That's the wool. "His disgrace. He was bailiff," she said, spitting out the word "was. "How he loved to lord it over us all, swanning about in his red robes, but not anymore," and so forth. So it's obviously public knowledge, and we have the facts. What O'Farrell has done, I may speculate, is to ask herself, how would losing your status in a small town affect you? What would you do? How would you behave? Of course, she doesn't have a psychiatrist's report from the middle of the 16th century, but her insights seem to me to be utterly plausible, especially the idea that John Shakespeare would become an abusive father, that he would try to regain the power he had lost socially by imposing that in a very vindictive way on his family. But although we can trace some facts from Shakespeare's life and from records and legal documents and find them echoed in the novel, I really want to go in a different direction and ask, to what extent is the novel shaped less by historical fact and more by Shakespeare's plays? You might have figured I'd go there. After all, I taught Shakespeare for years. Could we argue, or can I argue, that O'Farrell's novel depends on her understanding of Shakespeare's work, especially his fascination with twins and with the complicated issues of parenting? And could we consider the conditions under which the plays were produced as well? I'd like to start with that last point, and to return to the first time we see through Shakespeare's eyes Agnes Hathaway. So I'm going back to number 4. He is just about to turn and face his pupils when he sees from the trees a figure emerge. For a moment, the tutor believes it to be a young man. He is wearing a cap, a leather jerkin, gauntlets. He moves out of the trees with a brand of masculine insouciance or entitlement covering the ground with booted strides. I've already talked about the verb. Note the beginning. The tutor believes it to be a young man. But it's not a young man. Number 7, then he registers the long plait hanging over the shoulder, reaching past the waist. The jerkin lays tight around a form that curves suspiciously inwards around the middle. He sees the skirts, which had been bunched up, now hastily being dragged down around the stockings. He sees a pale oval face under the cap, an arched brow, a full red mouth. I suggest that Shakespeare's audiences might have recognized what's happening right away. We know that women didn't appear on the stage of the public or even the private playhouses in Shakespeare's time. All of the women's roles were played by young men, perhaps by boys whose voices had not yet changed, so maybe 12, 13, 14. Costume and body language were crucial. But frequently in Shakespeare's plays, he takes the theatrical convention and practice that a boy is playing a girl, and then spins it once more so that the boy playing a girl disguises himself as a boy. Follow me? Boy, girl, boy. Okay. And given that some 50 years ago, I wrote my PhD dissertation on the shrew and the disguised girl in Shakespeare's comedies, I blush to admit that the significance of this passage only hit me recently, namely the way in which women in disguise might fairly easily pass for men, in part because they were young men. We might think of Julia in The Two Gentlemen of Verona, disguised as a page, who follows her beloved Proteus from Verona to Milan. There's the wealthy Portia in The Merchant of Venice, who disguises herself as a young male lawyer and heads off to Venice to save the life of her husband's best friend, new husband's best friend. There's Rosalind, and As You Like It, banished from court, who heads off to the Forest of Arden, disguising herself as a young man, while her cousin Celia adopts a rustic attire, but stays in skirts. And of course, in Twelfth Night, there's Viola, shipwrecked in Illyria, thinking her twin brother Sebastian drowned, who dresses as a young man and becomes a page to Count Orsino. And in a very late play, Cymbeline, Imogen, who is the daughter of the King of Britain, disguises herself as a boy and leaves the court for the wilds of Wales, hoping to meet her banished husband Posthumus. The disguise is essentially just for safety and travel. But the real danger develops when she finds that Posthumus has become extremely jealous and plans for her death. So Imogen shifts into another disguise as a young man calling herself Fidele, fidel, faithful, unlike her husband, and meets her long-lost brothers who feel a strange, inexplicable connection to the young man. What's striking to me about all of these women is their initiative, their strength. I would add in a character like Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream, who is willing to leave Athens and her father to meet her beloved Lysander in the woods so that they can escape the strict Athenian law and her father's insistence that she marry someone else. Or there is All's Well's Helena, an orphan raised at the court of the Countess of Rousillon, who travels to Paris to cure the king of his mysterious illness and to follow the man she loves, Bertram, the Countess's son. Each of these women faces a difficult situation, and almost all of them leave relative comfort and safety, or at least a familiar world, to travel and manage for themselves. It helps, of course, that Portia has lots of money, and Rosalind, though banished because of her father, also seems to have plenty of cash, enough to buy a cottage for herself and cousin Celia. Yet over and over again in the comedies, Shakespeare's plays show us feisty and independent women willing to face an often hostile world. And here I turn to Agnes, who is, for most readers of O'Farrell's novel, the most intriguing figure. I find this first appearance a nod, perhaps a concealed one, not only to the way in which we can't easily distinguish young men and young women, because that's going to turn out to be the central plot twist of the novel, but to her understanding of Shakespeare's strong female characters. Even though there are usually only a few women in any given Shakespeare play, they are memorable, and they dominate the comedies. They, not the men, understand what is going on. They often teach the men about love and loyalty and truth. One of the most striking examples comes in The Merchant of Venice, when Portia, disguised as a male lawyer, is able to outwit Shylock and to save Antonio's life. And as I watch or read the trial scene in that play, I often think to myself, what does it say about Venice and about the power structures of Venice and the men of Venice that no one in Venice seems to be able to come up with a strategy for dealing with Shylock? No one. The Duke of Venice tries to convince Shylock to change his mind. That doesn't work. At one point, the Duke even threatens to dismiss the court unless he can get some outside legal advice. And he does get that outsider in the person of Portia, who is doubly outside. She doesn't live in Venice, and she's a woman, albeit disguised, in a man's world. And I would argue that it is her very outsiderness that helps in this situation, as she tries to appeal to Shylock's sense of mercy, and when that doesn't work, produces the trump card, a pound of flesh but not a drop of blood. Now, I'm not claiming that Agnes Hathaway is a disguised boy or a lawyer, and certainly not a wealthy heiress, although we know that her father did leave her some money in his will, and he did call her Agnes. What I am suggesting is that O'Farrell certainly knows Shakespeare's women, and the one she creates is, in her own way, a worthy addition. And Agnes has a Shakespearean antecedent in Helena from All's Well, whose father was a noted physician. We don't hear about her herbal remedies in All's Well, but Helena dares to travel to Paris to cure the desperate languishings whereof the king is rendered lost. And I use that verb dare deliberately because she's risking a lot. The Countess even says, he and his physicians are of a mind, he that they cannot help him, they that they cannot help. How shall they credit a poor, unlearned virgin when the schools, emboweled of their doctrine, have left the danger to itself? But Helena is determined to try, even at the risk of her life. And when she gets to the court and insists to the king that, who's obviously had too many medical treatments tried on him, that she can cure him, the king asks, "What darest thou venture?" And I thought I had, there we go. "What darest thou venture?" "Tax of impudence," she says, "a strumpet's boldness, a divulged shame, traduced by odious ballads. My maiden's name seared otherwise, no worse of worst, extended with vilest torture, let my life be ended." In other words, if I can't cure you, kill me. Torture me to death, smear my reputation. We never find out what Helena gives the king, and I'm tempted to say it's the power of belief, namely that he can be cured, and I think we find her determination striking. O'Farrell gives, let me just go back one more, gives Agnes that same kind of determination, whether she's quietly taking over the domestic duties in the Shakespeare household, or heading out to the woods to give birth to her first child, Susanna, or mixing up herbal remedies. In that last aspect, she becomes, as Helena is, a physician, not one hiding behind a hideous mask, and not learning from her father but her mother. She is a woman confident in her ability to help. O'Farrell cites in her acknowledgments the book known as Gerard's Herbal, which is an amazing collection of drawings and texts about plants. Sorry, that isn't reproducing as well as I would like, but that's garden rue. And here is the recipe for what you can do with rue when you boil it with dill, fennel seed, and some sugar. We feel fairly sure that Shakespeare may have consulted it, because over and over again in his plays he refers to herbs. And it's clear that O'Farrell has, as she creates Agnes Hathaway. Although we do not find, as we do with Ben Jonson, a personal statement from Shakespeare about losing his son, his words for Constance in King John, a play possibly written about 1597 or so, the year after Hamnet's death, are unforgettable and often quoted in this context. Constance is the widow of Henry II's son, Geoffrey, and their son, Geoffrey's dead, their son Arthur has been captured by King John. That's the bad King John, the Robin Hood King John. Geoffrey's son should, by the hierarchy of inheritance, be the next king of England, since Geoffrey was older than John, but it's clear that isn't going to happen. So when Constance, her hair unbound as a sign of her grief, storms onto the stage, we hear the full-throated expression of her feelings. And I thought I would play you Constance.
You hold too heinous a respect of grief.
He talks to me that never had a son.
You are as fond of grief as if your child.
Grief fills the room up of my absent child. Lies in his bed. Walks up and down with me. Puts on his pretty looks. Repeats his ways. Stuffs out his gracious garments with his form. Then have I reason to be fond of grief. So fare you well. Had you such loss as I could give better comfort than you have. I will not keep this form upon my head when there is such disorder in my wit. Oh Lord, my boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy,
People who write about this always quote those opening lines about grief fills the room up of my absent child. But for me, the pain is in those last two lines. Could not be simpler. My boy, my Arthur, my fair son, my life, my joy, my food, my all the world. You don't need fancy metaphors to know how much that hurts. And I think Maggie O'Farrell knew that. The fact that Arthur is still alive, although in the preceding scene John orders his death, doesn't minimize the power of her words. We know that King John was written by 1598 because it appears in a list of plays, so it could be after Hamnet's death, but it could have been written several years earlier. I can't argue for a direct biographical influence, but it's hard not to feel there is one. And the figure of the lost child haunts Shakespeare's plays. Sometimes there's just a throwaway line, as when Capulet speaks of Juliet to Paris and says, "Earth has swallowed all my hopes, but she is the hopeful lady of my earth." And that's a play definitely before the death. They're the sons of Titus Andronicus killed in battle, their bodies carried into the play's first scene, as well as the appeal from the conquered Gothic queen, Tamora, not to kill her oldest son. "And if thy sons were ever dear to thee, oh, think my son to be as dear to me." Titus's dismissal of her play is just the first of his many mistakes in the play. The death of Hotspur in 1 Henry IV sends his father Northumberland into desperate words, less personal than Constance's, but still frightening. Let heaven kiss earth, this is from part 2. Now let not nature's hand keep the wild flood confined. Let order die, and let this world no longer be a stage to feed contention in a lingering act, but let one spirit of the firstborn Cain reign in all bosoms, that each heart being set on bloody courses, the rude scene may end, and darkness be the barrier of the dead. And Kate, who is Hotspur's widow, rebukes her father-in-law for not showing up with his army to the battle where Hotspur died. It's on the screen, but it's also number 9 on your sheet. "And him, O wondrous, him, O miracle of men, him did you leave, second to none, unseconded by you, to look upon the hideous god of war in disadvantage, to abide a field where nothing but the sound of Hotspur's name did seem defensible, so you left him." The devastating last line seems to me one that O'Farrell felt deeply, because if there's a recurrent accusation in this novel, it's that Shakespeare has abandoned his family. From the opening page, where Hamnet is alone, "There is no one here," to Agnes's angry confrontation of her husband after the burial with the phrase, "You weren't here," and repeatedly in the way we never read William or Shakespeare or William Shakespeare, O'Farrell reminds us of this desertion, of this absence. In addition to anger and grief, there is also guilt. And I think of the late play, Pericles, where Pericles, believing his wife to have died in childbirth, puts her carefully coffined body overboard, and then leaves the baby daughter with a royal couple whose city he earlier saved from starvation. But this couple turned out to be treacherous, arranged to have the daughter killed, although she is mercifully rescued by pirates, but then sold into a brothel. And they tell Pericles that his daughter is dead. He retreats into a kind of catatonic state, in sorrow all devoured, with shies shot through and biggest tears o'ershowered. He swears never to wash his face nor cut his hairs. He puts on sackcloth and to sea. He bears a tempest, which his mortal vessel tears, and then he rides it out. And indeed, in the next to last scene of the play, he's in an almost catatonic state, refusing to talk to anybody. I think of Agnes sitting by Hamnet's body with the door that's going to carry the body. A woman is sitting beside that door. She is motionless, back bent. This would be, by the way, on your handout. Yes. Same one, Grief of Pericles. Head lowered. It is not immediately apparent that she even breathes. Her hair is disarrayed and falls in strands around her shoulders. Her body is curved over, her feet tucked under, her arms outstretched, the nape of her neck exposed. That notion of you disarray your hair, you take it out of its cap to show your grief, like Constance. She discovers that it is possible to cry all day and all night, that there are many different ways to cry, the sudden outpouring of tears, the deep racking sobs, the soundless and endless leaking of water from the eyes. Pericles bears a tempest. Agnes finds many different ways to cry. And although Agnes cannot understand how her husband can be writing a comedy after Hamlet's death, and it's a little difficult to be sure which one it is, I'm guessing it might be The Merry Wives of Windsor, though, which was a domestic comedy that was performed before the Queen. The turn to writing history plays, as he did in 1596 and 97, may have some biographical connection. O'Farrell explains it in terms of psychological safety. He and his friends have just performed a historical play about a long-dead king at the palace. It is proved he has found, he is, of course, Shakespeare, a subject safe for him to grapple with. There are, in such a story, no pitfalls, no reminders, no unstable ground to stumble upon. When he is enacting old battles, ancient court scenes, when he is putting words into the mouths of distant rulers, there is nothing that will ambush him, tie him up, and drag him back to look on things he cannot think about. He can manage these histories and comedies. He can carry on. Only with them can he forget who he is and what has happened. This, for me, is like what she does with John Shakespeare. What would be the reaction? Well, you avoid that which hurts. So I'm not surprised that Shakespeare isn't writing plays about dead children right away. He's thinking, at least in O'Farrell's point of view, about writing things that aren't going to hurt so much. Yet even in writing 1 and 2 Henry IV, which are for many Shakespeare's crowning achievement in the history play genre, Shakespeare does not really avoid the painful reality of a father, Henry IV, estranged from his son, Prince Hal. Henry even wishes that Hotspur, his political and military enemy, were his son. When he does finally talk with his son mid-play, he starts by saying that God must be punishing him by breeding revengement and a scourge for me, which I think you will agree is hardly a good way to get your son to listen to you. And even though Prince Hal saves his father's life at the end of part 1, in part 2 they seem just as estranged as before, until they have one scene together and the father dies. So the question of the relationship between the father and the son, which the novel raises primarily by its absence, may well have haunted the real playwright, not just the fictional one. So I'm not surprised that O'Farrell chooses as her ending a scene at the Globe where the play that haunts this novel from the beginning is being performed. Those of you who have read the novel may have already formed your opinion, and for those who haven't, I'm not going to tramp over the devastating moment. But we keep hearing echoes from Hamlet at crucial moments in the novel, such as when Judith asks about her dead brother, will he never come back? And Agnes answers with a line from Ophelia's song, he never will come again. And the moment of Hamlet's death is simple. O'Farrell writes, then there is silence, stillness, nothing more. Shakespeare writes Hamlet's last words, the rest is silence. So let me turn to the question not of Hamnet and Hamlet, but of Hamnet and Judith, the twins, and of Shakespeare's fascination with twins, something that makes a lot of sense. He had twins. One of Shakespeare's earliest plays, perhaps even his very first play, was about twins, and it was adapted from 2 Roman comedies by Plautus. There were 2 sets of twins. They'd been separated not long after birth. They grow up in separate cities until the day when one twin comes to the city where the other one lives, not knowing that fact, and being very dense about the fact that all sorts of people recognize him, including the wife he doesn't know he has. Everything ends happily with both sets of twins, master and servant, and even the long-lost father and mother restored. It's a play that must have been written before Hamlet's death, probably in the early 1590s, and it looks at the unexpected presence of the twins as the play's title. It's a comedy of errors. And then, somewhere around 1600 to 1602, which is certainly after Hamlet's death, Shakespeare returns to twins in Twelfth Night. And this time, there's both a male and a female, Sebastian and Viola. Viola is shipwrecked in Illyria but rescued. Her brother seems dead, although the captain says that he saw her brother bind himself to a strong mast that lived upon the sea. So the hope is there, and sure enough, a few scenes later, Sebastian appears, rescued by another sea captain, Antonio, and thinking his sister drowned, plans to travel to Illyria. We may be reassured, but we wait, and of course neither knows about the other. The turning point comes when Viola, disguised as a boy, the disguised girl, is trapped into a duel and saved when Antonio, who has followed Sebastian to Illyria, bursts upon the scene, is arrested by the Duke's officers as an enemy to the Duke, and asks Viola for the purse with money that he has given to Sebastian. Viola is puzzled and offers half of her small amount of money, and Antonio explodes. And I thought that it's worth watching, especially Viola's face as he explodes.
Let me speak a little. This youth that you see here, I snatched one half out of the jaws of death, relieved him with such sanctity of love, and to his image, which methought did promise most venerable worth, did I devotion.
What's that to us? The time goes by. Away!
Oh, how vile an idol proves this god. Thou hast, Sebastian, done good features shame. In nature there's no blemish but the mind. None can be called deformed but the unkind. Virtue is beauty, but the beauteous evil are empty trunks all flourished by the devil.
Man grows mad. Come. Come, sir.
Lead me on.
Methinks his words too from such passion fly, he believes himself. So do not I. Prove true imagination. Oh, prove true that I, dear brother, be now tame for you.
Come hither, knight. Come hither, lady. We'll whisper or accompaniment to a most sage saws.
He named Sebastian. I my brother know, yet living in my glass. Even such and so in favour was my brother, and he went still in this scarlet fashion ornament, for him I imitate. Oh, if it prove, tempests are kind, and salt waves fresh in love.
Very. What we watch here is the realization by Viola that her brother must be alive. I love the look on her face. And her explanation takes us right into Hamnet and Judith and the way they have tricked people in the past and the central switch in the novel. I, my brother, know, yet living in my glass. For him I imitate. In the play, Viola imitates Sebastian, and in so doing might be said metaphorically to keep him alive.
Go.
Please.
O'Farrell has to know this speech. It occurs to Hamnet as he crouches there next to Judith that it might be possible to hoodwink death, to pull off the trick he and Judith have been playing on people since they were young, to exchange places and clothes, leading people to believe that each was the other. Their faces are the same. People remark on this all the time, at least once a day. Could he pull off their trick, their joke, just once more? He thinks he can. He thinks he will. And he does, deceiving even Agnes. Twelfth Night offers us, I would say, the wish fulfillment version of the twins who appeared as each other and who are both alive. Hamnet, in this case, tells the story differently, that the substitution, the imitation, leads to death. As some of you may know, I had hoped to visit Stratford in January, and I thought to myself that maybe I could follow the description in O'Farrell's novel to see if I could discover where Hamnet is buried. There's the church, of course. Oh, sorry. There's a description of that. Inside the church, I'll just shift to that. Inside the church is where we have the family graves, William, Anne, Susanna, her husband John Hall, Thomas Nash. And on Shakespeare's birthday, those graves are covered with flowers. because people come in and leave bouquets there. Neither Judith nor Hamnet's graves are there or marked. When Hamnet died, his father was not yet a famous playwright, so O'Farrell is free to invent a gravesite. And she says it's over at the far side of the graveyard. Just beyond it, the river is taking a slow, wide bend, turns its waters in another direction. How Hamnet would have loved this patch of ground, if he could have chosen, if he were here next to her, if she could turn to him and ask him, she is sure he would have pointed at this very spot next to the river. I leave you not with the real grave, but with the thought that O'Farrell has actually brought to life two people about whom we know so little, Agnes and Hamnet. But she did have help, I would suggest, from the absent father, from the man she never names, from the sweet swan of Avon, William Shakespeare. Thank you. Questions? Must be some. There's a ringer here, John Rayburn, my former department chairman, and Ed Folsom, my former department chairman. Yes, John.
This is not really a question, but I thought the novel was quite wonderful. And I was thinking, what other novels are there that give the life of Shakespeare? I think, Right as the Sun.
Well, there's one by Anthony Burgess called Nothing Like the Sun, which is a kind of satirical novel. I'm not as wild about it, although there is a memorable passage in there where Will Kemp, who was the comedian, is sort of riffing on things. I don't think any one of them has ever come close. I mean, Burgess actually came to Iowa, in fact, and talked about that novel. But I don't think anything has come as close as this. And in part, I think it's the very avoidance. It's the fact that he's the Latin teacher, the Latin tutor, the father, the brother, the husband. We keep knowing who he is, and we bring that to us. But the people in the novel don't think of him that way. I mean, to John Shakespeare, he's the oldest son who's, doing something weird in London and was a layabout in town. So I don't know anything as powerful as this, John. But in some ways, it's by not making Shakespeare the center that I think she does it. It's by giving us both Hamnet and Agnes and their relationship to him. And at the center of that relationship, there's this black hole where he isn't there. And that's the thing that gets me. He's just not there. Because his mind is somewhere else.
She enforces that by never naming his name.
Never naming him. Yeah, she said in an interview that she found it difficult to think of a line like William Shakespeare sat down to a bowl of porridge. But I think it's this deeper thing, though. I think it's A, they don't know. B, we know. She also has said, and I think this is useful, that she was trying in some sense to get us to reimagine him, not to come with fixed things. It's one of the reasons she calls her Agnes, we would say Agnes, instead of Anne, because the scholar's take on her is that this was the older woman who enticed Shakespeare into marrying her, so forth. Well, in this one she sort of does, but she does so many other wonderful things. I mean, I love the way in this novel she gets Shakespeare to London, by creating this notion. So that's it. But I think you're right that the name is never there. Sorry, there was a question over here somewhere. Yes.
So did you say you didn't get to Stratford?
I didn't get to Stratford. I didn't. I was going to try and take pictures. So I wrote to a friend of mine who sent me some of the photographs, but we don't know where the grave is. And as I say, Hamnet, his father was a famous man then. Judith lived to be 61 or something. She died years after her father. Her grave isn't up there with the rest of the family either, and I think that's because her marriage was seen as tricky. She married a guy named Thomas Quiney, who had gotten another woman pregnant. And this came out about 6 weeks after the marriage. And I think that she was not seen. The granddaughter, Elizabeth Hall, Susanna's daughter, she's buried there. Her husband's buried there. Anne is buried there, so forth. The guy who married Elizabeth, but neither of the twins. We don't know where they are. By this time, they would have found him, I think. Yeah. Other questions? Yes, Kathy.
Were Shakespeare and his wife buried in the church originally, or were they?
No, they were married in Temple Grafton. Buried.
Yeah, were they buried in the church?
This I'm not sure of, but I think so. And when I asked a friend of mine who works in the, at the Shakespeare Center and was on the history side of things, I said, why are they up there in front of the high altar? You know, world's most famous playwright. She said, it's because he gave a lot of money to the church. Those of you who are church givers know about tithes, you know, a tenth. And Shakespeare evidently was into speculating on the tithes. That is, that you could designate the amount you would give, sort of betting on what the year's harvest would be, and say that you would give that much. Well, obviously, if there was a better harvest, you made a whole bunch of money. It's like speculating on futures, right? And Shakespeare evidently did give quite a lot of money to the church. His son-in-law, John Hall, was a very well-known physician who married Susanna, even treated the Bishop of Worcester. John Hall did, wrote a book about treating people. So I think it may be a combination of the Shakespeare and the John Hall, but I gather that the root of it is money to the church. And when you go to Holy Trinity now, if you want to see the graves, they do ask you to contribute something. But I must say that when you go in on the birthday celebration, which is the Saturday closest to the birthday, there's a parade through town and everybody's carrying bouquets, and you put a little sprig of rosemary for remembrance in your bouquet, and you walk into the church, and that entire area in front of the altar is completely covered with flowers. And it just gives me a thrill to realize that we're still celebrating this man. Other questions or comments? Or if not, okay, John.
Why are you so pessimistic about not finding the burial site when there are still unexplored parking lots?
You know, I think they haven't thought creatively. There have been all kinds of attempts to try and dig up where Shakespeare is buried so they could do DNA analysis and stuff, and the vicars have quite rightly refused to do that. So I don't know, but you'd have to overturn. You'd have to do. It's not the party; it's the whole area right outside the church, and there are gravestones all over those yards. I don't think they're going to let us do it. David, it's your chance.
Well, I gave you a chance to feed me a question.
I know.
So obviously
Okay.
It wasn't needed. You have a lot of
Okay. Well, I thought you were going to ask about All Is True, which I even rewatched just to be ready for you. Yes.
I just have a comment to make that when COVID first started here in Iowa, I had recently moved to Oak Knoll, and I was shopping at Pine Beach. While I was waiting for the Oak Knoll bus, a figure dressed as the physician
Like the physician with the beak?
came out, and I thought it was the symbol of death. I didn't know it was the physician.
Well, it's the physician, but it's interesting that I think the notion is that you ward off death maybe by looking like death or something like that. But you raise a wonderful point. This is about this novel. She didn't plan for it to come out in the pandemic, but it did. And I didn't even talk about all the stuff about the plague in that wonderful chapter in the middle where she describes how she thinks the plague might have come to Stratford. But I think in addition to the value and the worth of the novel in itself, the timing was fortuitous. She's been thinking about this for years. She actually put off writing the part about Hamnet's death until after her own son was past 11. She said she didn't think she could stand to do it while, she needed to get her son older than Hamnet for that. Thank you for coming. Refreshments. We appreciate it.